In this video, I'll review concepts from Chapter 22 of Human Anatomy and Physiology, 11th edition. This chapter focuses on the respiratory system. In particular, we'll be continuing with the airway by looking at structures of the lower airway. I'll remind you these include the larynx, the trachea, the bronchial tree, and the alveoli within the lungs. So let's start at the top with the larynx. The larynx attaches to that free-floating hyoid bone. It's continuous with the trachea, so the trachea is inferior to the larynx. And its functions, it is going to provide a patent airway. So in this case, patent means that it remains open. So space remains in the center. It is open to air, patent airway. It routes air and food into the proper channels. So air going down into the trachea, food over into the esophagus, and within it are housed the vocal folds, which are involved in or responsible for voice production. And the vocal folds include both true and false vocal folds within this larynx. Let's take a look at the internal structures of the larynx. So just to orient you, here is the Adam's apple, also known as the laryngeal prominence, and it is made up of this thyroid cartilage, which is, again, along with the cricoid cartilage, another structure of hyaline cartilage, helping to keep this larynx patent so air can move in and out. Additionally, you can see up here at the top is the epiglottis. This is another structure made of elastic cartilage, and this structure closes when swallowing to help protect the trachea from any food or drink. And that keeps that food or drink out of the lungs, which are at the other end of this trachea. In the center here, you can see the two vocal cords. We have the true vocal cords inferior and the false vocal cords are superior. And together, those are helping to produce sound and to help that sound to resonate. And then next, we'll take a look at the glottis, which is formed by the coming together of the true vocal cords from the left and right side of the larynx. So here we're seeing this from a superior view. We're looking down on the larynx, and what you can see here is the glottis. The glottis is this structure formed by these vocal cords. So you can see that the vocal cords come together, they can come apart, and depending on the spacing between them, the tightness of those cords, different tones are going to be produced, different sounds can be produced. So the true vocal cords are going to be medial, and they are vibrating to produce sounds. So they're actually producing the sounds, hence they're called the true vocal cords. The false vocal cords are lateral, so you can kind of see them off to the side of the true cords, and they're going to help the glottis to close during swallowing. So they're playing a more mechanical role in closing the glottis. They can also, they're thought to help to provide some resonance to the sound that is being produced by the true vocal cords. So that's the glottis. The glottis is that opening, or when it's closed, you can see it's the true vocal cords. So the space between the false vocal cords, I guess I could also say. All right, now let's move down from the larynx into the trachea. When we get to the trachea, you'll see that it has three layers. So this innermost layer is the mucosa. So here is the mucosa. It's the lining of the lumen of the trachea. Remember, a lumen is that open space, in this case where air is passing. The mucosa is lined with ciliated pseudostratified columnar epithelium, as well as goblet cells. And so these goblet cells are going to be producing mucus. Underneath that mucosa is going to be a submucosa made up of connective tissue. And underneath that submucosa will be the adventitia. And so the adventitia is connective tissue that encases C-shaped rings of hyaline cartilage. So you can see here one of these C-shaped rings, which, see if I have a better picture of that. Here we go. Here's a different picture of that. You can see around the trachea those C-shaped rings. So there's actually there is some space in the back where the cartilage does not surround. And that is because there is an esophagus back there, and this gives some space for expansion of the esophagus as food is passing through. So now from the trachea, we pass into this bronchial tree. And it's called a tree because the bronchi have 23 orders of branching. So it's basically like the trunk of a tree is the trachea, and then the big limbs would be primary bronchi, and then it starts to branch out into smaller and smaller branches. So again, this entire structure is called the bronchial tree, starting with the primary bronchi, and as you'll see, it will end in the alveoli. So we'll start here in this structure called the carina. This is the point at which the trachea branches into the two primary bronchi. It's the right and the left primary bronchi serving the right and the left lungs respectively. And in fact, those main bronchi, the primary bronchi, enter through what's called the hilum of the lung. So each lung has a hilum, just like you've already seen in the spleen and you will also see in the kidney. Each hilum is the entry point for that bronchus into the lung. So once entering the lung, the bronchus, those primary bronchi, are going to split. And they're going to split into what are called lobar bronchi or secondary bronchi. The reason they're called lobar is because each of those is going to target one of the lobes of the lung. So you can see over here in the right lung there are 3 lobes, and so there are 3 lobar bronchi. In the left lung there are only 2 lobes, so you only see 2 lobar bronchi. The branches then become smaller and smaller. From those secondary lobar, we get into these segmental or tertiary bronchi, so more splitting happening within each lobe. From those tertiary bronchi, the branches become smaller. Once they're under 1 millimeter, those are termed bronchioles. Once they are under half of a millimeter, they're termed terminal bronchioles. So just to give you a rundown again, we have the trachea splitting at the carina into the primary or main bronchi, 2 of those, then splitting further into the secondary or lobar bronchi, 2 in the left, 3 in the right, and then splitting into the tertiary or segmental bronchi. From those, as they become smaller and smaller, splitting into bronchioles, and then finally terminal bronchioles. And that's the bronchial tree. Once we get to the end there, those terminal bronchioles, we enter the respiratory zone of the bronchial tree. So that begins after those terminal bronchioles. So you can see that here. Here's some terminal bronchioles, and now we have these things called respiratory bronchioles. So this is the beginning of the respiratory zone. The respiratory zone structures include those respiratory bronchioles, as well as alveolar ducts, the alveolar sacs, and finally, these little grape-like, they look like grapes at least, these grape-like structures called alveoli. And these are going to be the main sites of gas exchange in the lungs, the alveoli. So the alveolar sacs contain clusters of these alveoli. Here you're seeing a cross-section of the lung in which you can see a respiratory bronchiole, as well as a respiratory duct, which is this larger opening. An alveolar sac is a grouping of alveoli, and then you can see lots of individual alveoli, which are surrounded by very thin layers of epithelium. And you can see that in this illustration as well. Here we have an alveolar sac, the alveolar duct leading into that sac, and then the individual alveoli with their very thin membranes around them. Before moving on to a little bit more information about the alveoli, I'll have a question here. What is the name for the branches of the bronchial tree that have a diameter of less than half of a millimeter? Choose the most specific correct answer. Once you've done that, continue on with this video. So let's look a little more closely at the alveoli. Note they are completely surrounded by capillaries, which should make sense because these are the main sites for gas exchange between the atmosphere and the blood. So this is where all of that atmosphere that was breathed in moved through the trachea, through the bronchi, through these bronchioles, all the way down to these alveoli. This is where the exchange is actually happening. So the air is moving between those alveoli and these capillaries filled with pulmonary blood. The membrane between those structures, between the capillaries, which you can see here at various points surrounding an alveolus, it's going to be very, very thin. So less than a half of a micron thick. That's much, much thinner than that half millimeter we were talking about with the terminal bronchi, orders of magnitude smaller. That's important because the gases are going to use simple diffusion for movement between the blood and the air in the alveoli. So the shorter the distance, the faster and more efficient that diffusion is going to be. This means that the alveolar walls are actually, typically, they're just a single layer of simple squamous epithelium. These are also known as type 1 alveolar cells, so these thin, simple squamous epithelial cells. And that's what's separating here. This is the alveolar side of this membrane between gas and blood. So now we have other cells of the alveoli. It's not just those type 1 alveolar cells. You can see these type 2 alveolar cells scattered throughout. These cells are responsible for the secretion of a substance called surfactant, which you'll get into a little later, the importance of that substance, as well as antimicrobial proteins. So these are secreting cells, these type 2 alveolar cells. Additionally, there are alveolar macrophages, shown in purple, blue. Again, it's kind of scattered throughout the alveoli, and they are responsible for cleaning up debris within the alveoli. There are about 2 million of these macrophages carried by cilia per hour up and out of the throat to be swallowed. So there's a lot happening in your lungs, and these macrophages are helping to carry any debris that does get into your lungs, help to carry them up and out of the airway. All right, so one last question. Through which two cell types must gases pass to diffuse from air to blood in the lungs? You might need to go back to that illustration a few slides back to find the answer to this one.